In the 1880s, people called this city the richest on earth. And they didn't mean the richest in Australia. They meant the richest place in the world. Land in the centre of Melbourne sold for what land cost in the centre of London, and it was the second biggest city in the whole British Empire, beaten only by London itself. Men lit their pipes with £5 notes just to show off. So how did the richest city in the world become the city that history forgot? These are 12 things Melbourne had and then lost. 40 years before any of that, Melbourne wasn't a city at all. It was a scatter of tents and mud huts on the banks of the Yarra River, a rough settlement barely 15 years old, with sheep tracks for streets. Then, in 1851, someone found gold in the hills to the north, and everything changed. New Gold Mountain. Number 1. New Gold Mountain. That's the name Chinese miners gave this corner of the world in the 1850s, and for once the marketing was honest. In 1851, gold turned up in the hills around Ballarat and Bendigo, a few days' walk from that young settlement on the Yarra. What followed was one of the largest gold rushes in human history. Ships sat empty and abandoned in the bay because the crews had walked off to go digging, some of them never coming back. Police, servants, and labourers downed tools and bolted for the goldfields, and for a while the young colony could barely keep itself running. Men arrived from England, Ireland, China, and the goldfields of California with nothing in their pockets, and a lucky few walked away rich enough to never work another day. The colony of Victoria was pulling gold out of the ground faster than almost anywhere on the planet, and every ounce of it flowed back through one port, one set of banks, one city. Within a single decade, the whole colony went from a quiet backwater to one of the fastest growing places on earth, and Melbourne was the funnel every new arrival passed through. By 1865, the city had passed Sydney to become the most populous in Australia, and it kept on climbing. In 1880, it held about 280,000 people. By the end of that decade, it was pushing towards 500,000, growing more than 3 times faster than births alone could ever explain. The rest was people, pouring in from every corner of the world to get close to the money. Here's the part people forget when they picture a gold rush. The diggers out on the goldfields got the legend, but the real fortune settled back in town, in the offices and the warehouses and the counting houses, in the hands of the merchants who sold the shovels, financed the claims, and shipped the gold home to London. Melbourne didn't get rich digging. It got rich by being the place every ounce of that gold passed through on its way somewhere else. And there was a staggering amount of it. For 40 years, the gold kept coming, and the city built itself into something nobody in the southern half of the world had ever seen. Wide boulevards. Banks with marble floors and gold leaf on the ceilings. A skyline going up while most Australian towns were still timber and dust. If you'd stood on Collins Street in 1880 and told someone this would all one day be a footnote, they would have laughed you into the gutter. By then, the muddy village on the Yarra had become something the whole world had a name for. The city that rivaled London. Number 2. The city that rivaled London. By the 1880s, the wealth had gone from impressive to almost unbelievable. Central Melbourne land was changing hands for prices that matched the middle of London, and for a while the city was reckoned to be the richest in the world and the second largest in the entire British Empire. Only London itself was bigger. It got noticed abroad. The English novelist Anthony Trollope wrote about the place. The American writer Mark Twain would later marvel at it too. And in 1885, a visiting British journalist named George Augustus Sala took one look and christened it Marvellous Melbourne, a nickname that stuck for the next 100 years. The money did strange things to people. Newly rich diggers threw balls and feasts that would have embarrassed European royalty. One man reportedly filled a horse trough with champagne and invited passers-by to help themselves. Another used full champagne bottles as bowling pins. There are stories of £5 notes folded between slices of bread and eaten as a joke, and of men lighting their pipes with banknotes simply because they could. I mean, think about that for a second. This was a place so drunk on its own good fortune that money itself had become something to burn for entertainment. Underneath the theatre, though, the wealth was real, and it showed everywhere you looked. Melbourne had electric light before most of the world, first switched on in the Eastern Market in 1881, And within a year, the city had a generating station feeding 2,000 lamps. It had telephones. Out in the new suburbs of Toorak, South Yarra and Kew, the freshly rich built themselves palatial mansions on huge landscaped grounds. In town, grand hotels like the Menzies, glass-roofed shopping arcades and towering banking halls competed to outshine one another, while the young and fashionable paraded up and down Collins Street every afternoon in an activity they simply called doing the block. For 1 decade, Melbourne genuinely stood among the great cities of the earth, and it wanted the whole world to know it. The trams that ran on rope. Number 3. The trams that ran on rope. If you wanted proof that Melbourne saw itself as a world city, you looked at how it moved people. On the 11th of November, 1885, the first cable tram in the city rumbled into service, hauled along by a continuous steel rope buried in a slot beneath the road, running endlessly under the streets. There were no engines on board and no overhead wires. Instead, a grip car reached down through the road, clamped onto the moving cable to go, and released it to stop. Within 6 years, the network had exploded across the city. By the early 1890s, Melbourne's cable system ran roughly 75 kilometres of double track and around 1,200 cars and trailers, radiating out from the centre to the suburbs on more than a dozen routes, all of it run by a single private operator, the Melbourne Tramway and Omnibus Company. It was one of the largest cable tram systems anywhere in the world. Each route ran its own colour scheme, so you could tell at a glance where a tram was headed, and a chain of powerhouses hummed away across the inner suburbs, winding the great cables day and night. The trams shared those streets with something we have thankfully forgotten. In the 1890s, the most common thing on a Melbourne road wasn't the tram at all, it was the horse, tens of thousands of them, along with the mountains of manure they left behind for the street sweepers to shovel out of the gutters. That was the reality behind the elegant photographs. And then the whole cable network vanished. It ran for over 50 years, but through the 20s and 30s it was steadily converted to electric traction, and by 1940 the last of it had been torn up and thrown away. The slots in the road were paved over. The powerhouses were repurposed or knocked down. Today, most Melburnians riding an electric tram have no idea that the ground beneath them once hid one of the largest cable networks on the planet. And this next detail is where the pattern starts to show itself. Melbourne kept building marvels, and Melbourne kept demolishing them. Hold on to that, because it is about to happen again and again. The palace built for the world. Number 4. The palace built for the world. In 1880, at the very start of the golden decade, Melbourne threw open the doors of a building designed to announce its arrival. The Royal Exhibition Building, the work of the architect Joseph Reed, one of the most prolific designers of the boom, was raised in the Carlton Gardens to host the Melbourne International Exhibition, one of those great world's fairs that cities fought each other to stage. Its dome rose over the treetops, visible for miles, a statement in brick and timber and slate that this young colony belonged in the same conversation as Paris, Vienna, and London. 8 years later, at the very peak of the boom, the city did it again, hosting the enormous centennial exhibition to mark 100 years since European settlement. Crowds poured in from across the colonies and around the world, more than 1 million visits over its run. Machines, art, and manufactured goods from dozens of nations filled the halls, and for months Melbourne put its wealth on display for anyone who cared to come and look. Here is the strange thing about this one. Of all the wonders on this list, the exhibition building is the survivor. It should have been demolished like the rest, and it very nearly was, more than once across the 20th century, dismissed for decades as an outdated white elephant that cost too much to keep. Instead, it went on to host the very first sitting of Australia's federal parliament in 1901, when the brand new nation had nowhere else grand enough to gather. And in 2004, it became the first building in the entire country to be granted UNESCO World Heritage status. So when you stand in the Carlton Gardens today and look up at that dome, understand exactly what you are seeing. You are looking at the last great monument of Marvellous Melbourne still standing where it was built. Almost everything else that once matched it is gone. Australia's first skyscraper. Number 5. Australia's first skyscraper. In 1889, on Elizabeth Street, the boom reached for the sky quite literally. The Australian building, later known as the APA building, climbed 12 stories and around 53 metres into the air, crowned with a spire. That may not sound like much today, but at the time it was astonishing. It was Australia's first true high-rise, made possible by new water-powered lifts, and it was described in its day as one of the tallest buildings in the world, standing alongside the early towers of Chicago and New York in ambition. For more than 20 years it remained the tallest building in Australia, only overtaken in 1912 by a tower in Sydney, and even then, the Australian building's spire still reached higher. It dominated the skyline. People said you could see it from almost anywhere in the city, this great banded tower looming over a colony that had been a sheep run within living memory. It even grew its own legends, tales of runaway lifts and of companies going broke just trying to sink the shafts deep enough to hold the hydraulic machinery. A workman was killed by a falling plank while it went up. This was a building people were willing to die to raise. And then, in 1980, they knocked it down. Australia's first skyscraper, the tower that had announced Melbourne to the world, stood for barely 90 years before it was demolished and replaced by a low, forgettable office block. The demolition was so rushed and untidy that a fragment of its banded brick facade was actually left stuck to the building next door, where a sharp eye can still pick out a sliver of it to this day. That is all that survives of it. A scrap of wall, hanging on by accident, on a street where glass towers now climb 3 and 4 times higher than the record the Australian building once held. And no, I am not making that up. The limit that held the city down. Number 6. The limit that held the city down. This one is the twist almost nobody knows. Melbourne built the tallest towers in the country during the boom, a whole cluster of 8, 10 and 12-storey giants going up between 1888 and 1892. And then the city grew frightened of what it had made. When the boom turned to bust, the whole mood around those towers changed. Now they just felt dangerous. They blocked the light from the narrow colonial streets, they crowded the footpaths below, and worst of all, the fire ladders of the day could not come close to reaching the upper floors of a 12-storey building. So in 1916, the city did something remarkable. It passed a law capping the height of every new building at 132 feet, roughly 40 metres, about the height of those old boom towers and not 1 story higher. Think about what that actually means. Melbourne had reached higher than any city in the country, then made it illegal to ever do it again. That single rule held the skyline flat for about 40 years. Clever architects found little ways to cheat it, sticking tall decorative towers on top of buildings that stopped at the legal line, like the spire of the Manchester Unity building, which is how a couple of towers crept past the limit without technically breaking it. But real height was banned. While the rest of the world raced upward through the 20th century, Melbourne stayed pinned to the exact height of its own boom, a city frozen at the moment it lost its nerve. It was not until the 1950s that a new generation finally lifted the cap and let the towers rise once more. The grandest ghost of them all. Number 7. The grandest ghost of them all. On the corner of Collins and King Streets stood a building so lavish that people came just to stand in its lobby and stare. The Federal Coffee Palace opened in 1888, right at the crest of the boom, and it was a coffee palace, which is one of the strangest and most Melbourne things on this entire list. You see, the boom collided head-on with the temperance movement, the campaign against alcohol, and out of that collision came the Coffee Palace, a grand hotel that served no liquor at all. The Federal was the largest and most opulent ever built, a French Second Empire fantasy of around 500 rooms designed in part by the boom architect William Pitt. It cost about £150,000, a colossal sum for the day. It rose 165 feet, with a soaring corner dome, marble staircases, ballrooms, and a glass-roofed lobby 4 floors high. For a moment, it was the tallest building in the city, and it was built by 2 of the great financiers of the boom, James Munro and James Mirams, using money raised from banks and building societies. Remember that name Munro, because he is going to matter enormously in a few minutes. For decades, the Federal was the beating heart of Melbourne society. Though it quietly took out a liquor licence in the 1890s once the money grew tight, and by the 1920s it had dropped the Coffee Palace name entirely and become, simply, the Federal Hotel. The temperance dream was dead. Slowly, the grand old building slid out of fashion as flashier hotels pulled the crowds away and the west end of the city faded. In 1971, it was sold to developers, and in 1973, despite loud and organized public protest, the wreckers moved in and pulled it to the ground for an office block. A demolition crew salvaged a handful of the statues and shipped them off to a sculpture park, and a single panel of cast iron railing went to a museum. That was it. The most opulent hotel in the history of the city, gone in a cloud of dust, remembered now only in old photographs and the ache of the people who fought to save it. You'd think someone would have stepped in and stopped it. Nobody did. If you've made it this far, you already know more about Marvellous Melbourne than most people who walk past its empty corners every day. There is a whole series of these on the channel, the lost places of Australia that were once the envy of the world. Subscribe and you'll catch the next one. Now, we have spent 7 chapters on what all this money built. It is time to look at what the money was hiding, and then at the disaster that swept the whole thing away. Smelburne. Number 8. Smelburne. For all the marble and the gold leaf, there was a secret rotting underneath the richest city on earth. Melbourne had grown so fast and so recklessly that it had never built a proper sewerage system. Nearly 500,000 people were living in a city that still dealt with its waste the way a country village did. Night soil men carted human waste out of backyards by hand, cart by cart, night after night. Open drains ran through the suburbs, and a great deal of the filth ended up in the Yarra, the very river the city had been born beside. The rich in their big houses could pay to have their cesspits emptied often and their surroundings kept clean. The working families crammed into Collingwood, Fitzroy and Richmond could not, and it was there, in the poorest streets, that the fever hit hardest. The result was exactly what you would expect. Disease moved through the crowded inner suburbs. Typhoid fever, spread through dirty water, killed people year after year in a city that could afford champagne troughs but somehow never a working sewer. So bad was the reputation for fever that Melbourne earned a name as one of the unhealthiest cities in the developed world, and in the hot months, the stench rising off the drains and the river could be genuinely unbearable. And the world took notice. In the 1890s, London newspapers began calling the marvellous city by a crueler name, Smelburne. It was a nasty little joke, and it landed hard because it was completely true. The city that lit its pipes with banknotes had built its glittering fortune directly on top of an open drain. So yeah, not great. It finally took a dedicated public works board and an enormous underground sewerage scheme begun in the 1890s to start cleaning the place up. And that rescue arrived at the worst possible moment, just as the money was about to run out completely. The land boom. Number 9. The land boom. Here is the thing that made the fortune, and it turned out to be the very same thing that destroyed it. Land. Through the 1880s, Melbourne fell out of love with gold and fell headlong in love with real estate. The idea took hold that city property could only ever rise in value, so everyone piled in at once. Clerks, widows, publicans, and politicians, all of them buying and selling blocks they never intended to build on, flipping paper for a quick profit. Ordinary people mortgaged their homes to get in on it. Servants speculated with their wages. Everyone, it seemed, knew someone who had doubled their money on a paddock they had never even seen. The numbers turned genuinely insane. Central Melbourne land prices rose by roughly 8 times between 1882 and 1888, until a patch of dirt in the city rivaled the value of ground in the heart of London. And the whole thing ran on borrowed money. British investors, hungry for the high returns Melbourne was paying, poured their savings across the world through a swarm of local banks and building societies that operated with almost no rules at all. There was no central bank to slow the party down, and no safety net waiting if it broke. It got worse than reckless. It got corrupt. Politicians were speculating on land while writing the very laws that governed it. Business and government tangled together so tightly that it became hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Whole fortunes were built on nothing but confidence and other people's deposits. The historian Michael Cannon would later give these men a name that stuck, the land boomers. And when it all came apart, many of them protected themselves with a notorious piece of law, the Voluntary Liquidation Act of 1891, which let insolvent companies quietly wind themselves up and shield their directors from scrutiny, while ordinary investors got nothing back at all. It looked unstoppable from the inside. It felt like the good times had simply become the way things were now. That belief, that the boom was permanent, seemed harmless enough at the time. It was about to cost tens of thousands of families everything they owned. The crash. Number 10. The crash. In 1890, on the far side of the world, a giant London bank called Baring Brothers nearly collapsed, and terrified British investors slammed their wallets shut overnight. The river of easy money that had flooded into Melbourne for a decade simply stopped flowing. And this is the part where things stopped being funny. With no fresh credit coming in, the land bubble had nothing left holding it up, and prices went into freefall. The speculators who had borrowed fortunes to buy dirt suddenly found the dirt was worth a fraction of what they owed on it, and one by one they went under. That was only round one. The building societies that had lent them the money began to fail, and by early 1892, around 40 of these land boom finance companies had already collapsed. Then the panic climbed all the way up to the banks themselves. On the 30th of January, 1893, the Federal Bank went down. Ordinary depositors, terrified of losing their life savings, rushed to pull their money out, and a full-blown run on the banks began. It became the worst financial crisis the city had ever seen, and Melbourne was the very centre of it. Even the Commercial Bank of Australia, the largest bank in the whole colony of Victoria, was forced to suspend withdrawals. On the 1st of May, 1893, the government declared a 5-day bank holiday, slamming the doors shut to try and stop the bleeding. Across the Australian colonies, 13 of the 22 trading banks suspended payments within a few weeks. In Melbourne, 9 of the 12 trading banks closed their doors, and nearly all of the city's building societies were wiped clean out of existence. Melbourne house prices fell by more than half. The national economy shrank by around 17%. And through the whole of the 1890s, it is reckoned that roughly 1 in 5 people in Melbourne could not find work. There was no dole and no safety net of any kind. Families that had been comfortable one year were queuing for charity soup the next, and thousands were turned out of homes they could no longer pay for. For the banks that clawed their way through, survival came at a brutal price. The commercial bank had to lock up its depositors' money and rebuild itself from the wreckage over years. A whole generation of Melburnians learned, the hard way, never to fully trust a bank with their savings again. The richest city in the world had become the epicenter of the deepest depression in Australian history. The Premier Who Ran. Number 11. The Premier Who Ran. Remember the name Munro, the temperance champion who helped build the Federal Coffee Palace. By the start of the 1890s, he had climbed all the way to the top. Munro was the Premier of Victoria, one of the most powerful men in the country, a pillar of the boom, and a very public advocate of clean, sober, respectable living. He was also quietly drowning. Munro's own companies were tangled up in exactly the reckless land speculation that was now falling to pieces all around him. As the crash closed in and his empire began to crumble, he did something that stunned the entire colony. In February of 1892, he had his own cabinet appoint him to a comfortable, well-paid government post over in London, re-signed as Premier, and boarded a ship out of Port Melbourne, sailing away just as the disaster he had helped to build came crashing down on the people he had governed. The outrage was volcanic. Thousands of investors had lost their entire life savings in his companies, and now the man most responsible had fled to a cushy post on the far side of the world. For someone who had preached thrift and sober living from every platform in the colony, it was a staggering piece of hypocrisy, and nobody forgot it. Eventually, the new Premier, William Shields, one of the very few politicians who had actually warned against the madness of the boom, recalled him from London. And to his slim credit, Munro came back to face it. In February of 1893, he was declared bankrupt, with personal debts of £97,000, while the companies he left behind carried debts of more than £600,000, a catastrophic figure for the time. And then, walking down a Melbourne street, Munro was set upon and beaten unconscious by a man who had been financially ruined in the collapse. He went down in history as the most notorious of the corrupt politicians of the entire boom era, the respectable temperance man who helped ruin thousands of ordinary families, and then tried to sail quietly away from the wreckage. The 15 Lost Years. Number 12. The 15 Lost Years. When the dust finally settled, Melbourne was still standing. The banks slowly reopened. The surviving trams kept running, but something essential had drained out of the place and would not come back. In 1890, the city held close to 500,000 people. 15 years later, that number had barely shifted. Immigration had dried up completely, and confidence was gone. And the people who could leave, left. The gold that had built New Gold Mountain hadn't actually run out. It had just moved on to fresh strikes in the deserts of Western Australia at Coolgardie and Kalgoorlie, and to the goldfields of South Africa. Thousands of Melburnians packed up and followed the money west and overseas, chasing the next boom because their own had died under them. A city that had spent 40 years growing at breakneck speed simply stopped, and stayed stopped, for the better part of 2 decades. There was one strange, brief second wind. When the Australian colonies joined together as a single nation in 1901, Melbourne became the country's first capital, and for the next 26 years the federal parliament sat right here while Canberra was slowly carved out of an empty paddock to the north. For a moment the city mattered on the world stage again, but it was borrowed importance, political rather than golden, and when the parliament finally packed up and moved to Canberra in 1927, even that quietly faded. The government that had run a whole nation went north, and Melbourne was left to be a large, handsome, ordinary city. Wealthy still, but no longer the wonder of the world. Sydney eventually grew past it once again. The title of richest city in the world moved on and never returned. And here is the quietest tragedy in the whole story. The city itself seemed to decide to forget. Across the century that followed, it pulled down its own monuments one by one, the Federal Coffee Palace, the first skyscraper, the grand boom hotels, until the physical evidence of the Golden Age had been almost entirely scrubbed away. You can walk down Collins Street today and stand on the exact spot where the richest square mile on earth used to be, and nothing will tell you. There's no plaque for the Federal Coffee Palace, and no marker where the tallest building in the country came down. Just a busy modern street that got on with things and let the marvellous parts slip quietly out of the story. If you want to see what happened to another Australian place that had everything and then lost it, that video is on the screen right now. Because Melbourne isn't the only one. It's just the one that was, for a little while, richer than London.